Scott Falater built his life around routine. In the Ahwatukee foothills of Phoenix, Arizona, a quiet suburban area known for orderly streets and predictable rhythms, Falater lived in a home that reflected stability rather than excess. The neighborhood was defined by early morning departures, trimmed lawns, and evenings that settled into silence. It was a place where patterns mattered and where deviation was noticeable. Falater was born in 1949 and, by the mid-1990s, had established himself as a reliable professional and family man. He worked as an engineer for Motorola, a position that required precision, long-term planning, and adherence to structured processes. Colleagues described him as methodical and dependable. He was not known for impulsive behavior. In meetings and daily interactions, Falater appeared reserved, focused, and controlled. Engineering suited him. The work rewarded attention to detail and penalized error. It required problems to be broken down, analyzed, and resolved systematically. This approach extended beyond his professional life. Falater carried the same emphasis on order into his home, his schedule, and his relationships. He was married to Jarmila Falater, known to friends and neighbors as Yarmi. She was originally from what was then Czechoslovakia and brought a different temperament into the household, more expressive, more socially engaged. The couple had 2 children and outwardly maintained a conventional family structure. School schedules, work routines, and neighborhood interactions followed a predictable pattern. To those around them, the Falater family did not stand out. They were not known for frequent disputes or dramatic displays. There were no public arguments, no repeated visits from law enforcement, no visible signs of instability. Neighbors later recalled a family that appeared quiet and self-contained. Falater's personality reinforced that impression. He was described as disciplined, sometimes distant, but rarely confrontational. He did not raise his voice in public. He did not engage in social conflict. His demeanor suggested restraint rather than volatility. This contributed to the perception that the household was calm, if somewhat emotionally reserved. Daily life followed structure. Falater left for work on schedule. Jarmila managed the household and the children's routines. Evenings were uneventful. There were no visible disruptions to suggest that the family was under strain. From the outside, the Falaters embodied the image of a stable suburban family. This image mattered. Falater valued predictability and control, not only in his environment, but in how his life was perceived. Stability was not just a condition, it was a standard. Deviations from routine were not welcomed. When problems arose, they were expected to be contained rather than expressed. There is no evidence from this period of escalating conflict that drew attention from outsiders. Friends and neighbors were unaware of any serious marital disputes. No restraining orders were filed. No formal complaints were made. Whatever tensions existed within the marriage remained private. That privacy was consistent with Falater's approach to life. He did not externalize stress. He compartmentalized. This tendency made it difficult for those around him to detect internal strain. To the outside world, the absence of visible conflict was interpreted as harmony. Professionally, Falater was regarded as reliable. Motorola trusted him with complex responsibilities. His work required sustained concentration and accountability. There were no disciplinary actions on record. His career trajectory reinforced the impression of a man in control of his circumstances. At home, that control translated into routine rather than warmth. Falater was present but emotionally restrained. He fulfilled expected roles: provider, parent, homeowner, without drawing attention to himself. This fulfilled social expectations, even if it did not necessarily foster emotional closeness. Jarmila Falater, by contrast, was seen as more expressive. She engaged with neighbors and participated in community interactions. The contrast between their personalities did not appear problematic on the surface. Many couples balance differing temperaments without conflict becoming visible. Importantly, There were no documented warnings that preceded the events of January 1997. No threats, no reports of fear, no indication that something within the household was approaching a breaking point. The calm was uninterrupted. This absence of warning signs played a critical role later. When investigators and jurors examined the case, they had to reconcile the brutality of the crime with the apparent normality that preceded it. The lack of overt conflict complicated simple explanations. Falater's life, up to that point, was defined by consistency. He lived where he worked. He worked within systems that rewarded control. He maintained a household that appeared stable. He did not attract attention. That consistency created an expectation, not just among neighbors and co-workers, but within Falater himself, that life would remain orderly. Problems, if they existed, were not addressed through confrontation or change. They were absorbed into routine. At this stage in the story, there is no indication of violence, premeditation, or instability visible to outsiders. The foundation of the case rests on this reality. The man at the center of what would become a widely discussed criminal trial was, until that point, indistinguishable from thousands of others living quiet, structured lives in suburban America. This context matters because it frames everything that follows. The events of the next chapters did not erupt from a history of chaos. They emerged from a life built on order, one that left little room for deviation, and even less room for collapse. For now, Scott Falater was simply a man defined by routine. An engineer, a husband, a father, a neighbor, a person whose life appeared to move forward without disruption. Nothing in his public life suggested that, within a single night, that structure would fracture beyond repair. The evening of January 16, 1997, unfolded without any outward sign that it would end in violence. In the Ahwatukee foothills neighborhood of Phoenix, routines continued as expected. Lights came on in homes as the sun set. Streets quieted. Nothing distinguished the Falater residents from the others lining the block. Inside the house, the family followed a familiar pattern. Dinner had been eaten earlier in the evening. There were no reports of arguments spilling into the street, no raised voices overheard by neighbors, no disturbances that would later serve as warning signs. From the outside, the night appeared ordinary. At some point after the household settled, the sequence of events that would later be reconstructed by investigators began. What is known about the timing comes not from a single source, but from a combination of physical evidence, witness observations, and forensic analysis. The attack did not occur in public view. It began inside the home, away from immediate detection. Yarmila Falater was attacked in the house. The assault involved a kitchen knife. The wounds were numerous, but they were not immediately fatal. Investigators later determined that the injuries alone would not have caused death. This distinction became central to understanding what followed. After the initial attack, the scene shifted. Yarmila Falater was moved from the interior of the house into the backyard. The Falater home had a swimming pool enclosed within the property. This transition, from inside to outside, required deliberate movement. It was not the result of a single impulsive act confined to one location. In the backyard, the final act occurred. Yarmila Falater was forced into the pool. Her head was held underwater until she drowned. The cause of death was determined to be asphyxiation by drowning, not the stab wounds inflicted earlier. This sequence mattered. It showed that the fatal outcome was not instantaneous. The violence unfolded in stages, across different areas of the property, without interruption. During this time, the surrounding neighborhood remained quiet. Several neighbors were awake. Some noticed movement in the Falater backyard. At least 2 witnesses later described seeing a man restraining a woman in the pool. The observations were brief, but specific. They included the positioning of bodies, the direction of movement, and the duration of the struggle. At the time, the witnesses did not immediately interpret what they were seeing as a homicide. The context did not suggest an emergency. There were no screams loud enough to prompt immediate calls to police. The scene, viewed from a distance and without context, did not register as a crime in progress. After Yarmila Falater was submerged and drowned, the activity in the backyard ceased. What followed was equally significant. The knife used in the attack was cleaned. Blood-stained clothing was removed and concealed. These actions did not occur under duress or in haste. They required awareness of evidence and an effort to manage it. The house was not left in disarray. There was no sign of a struggle spreading from room to room. Furniture remained in place. No objects were overturned. The environment suggested control rather than chaos. At no point during the night was there evidence of an intruder entering or exiting the property. Doors and windows showed no signs of forced entry. The perimeter of the home remained intact. By the time the night ended, the scene was quiet again. The backyard pool concealed a body. The house appeared unchanged. The neighborhood returned to silence. The following morning, the absence of movement became noticeable. Scott Falater did not appear. Her routine was broken. When her body was discovered in the pool, the initial assumption was not murder. The position suggested the possibility of an accident. That assumption did not last. Medical examination revealed the stab wounds. Investigators quickly determined that drowning alone couldn't explain the injuries. The sequence of events was reevaluated. What first appeared accidental was reclassified as a homicide. The lack of forced entry became immediately relevant. Investigators considered whether an unknown person could have entered the home, attacked Scott Falater, moved her to the pool, and left without leaving a trace. The physical evidence did not support that theory. There were no footprints, no broken locks, no signs of flight. The actions required familiarity with the layout of the house and the backyard. They required time. They required access. As investigators reconstructed the night, the sequence became clearer. The attack was not confined to a single moment or location. It involved movement, control, and continuation. This reconstruction did not rely on speculation. It was supported by the location and nature of the injuries, the position of the body, witness observations, the condition of the house and yard. Each element reinforced the same conclusion. The crime unfolded without interruption and without resistance from the environment itself. Equally important was what the investigation did not uncover. There was no evidence of theft. Nothing of value was missing. No attempt had been made to stage a burglary. The crime did not align with any pattern of random violence. The sequence of actions, attack, relocation, drowning, cleanup, suggested intent and continuity. It showed that the violence did not stop once harm was inflicted. It continued until a fatal outcome was ensured. This continuity would later become central to how the case was understood. It challenged explanations based on momentary loss of control or unconscious behavior. The actions required sustained physical engagement and decision-making across multiple steps. By the end of January 17, 1997, the quiet suburban setting of Ahwatukee foothills had become the center of a homicide investigation. The transformation was stark. A routine evening had given way to a crime scene that raised difficult questions. The absence of external involvement narrowed the focus. The lack of forced entry eliminated the simplest explanations. The method and sequence of the attack demanded closer scrutiny. This was not a crime marked by panic or interruption. It unfolded in a controlled environment over a period of time without interference. The night everything changed did not announce itself. It passed as quietly as it began. Only afterward did its significance become clear. In the chapters that follow, the investigation would move beyond the physical reconstruction of events. Attention would shift to what others saw, what was remembered, and how those observations contrasted with the explanation that would later be offered. The house, the pool, and the silence of the neighborhood had already told part of the story. The rest would come from those who witnessed fragments of the night, and from the account of the man who survived it. The most critical evidence from the night of January 16, 1997, did not come from inside the Falater home. It came from outside, in the form of independent eyewitness observations made by neighbors who were awake during the late evening hours. Ahwatukee Foothills was not a neighborhood accustomed to late-night activity. By that hour, most houses were dark. Street noise was minimal. This quiet made any movement stand out, even if it did not immediately signal danger. Several residents later reported noticing activity in the Falater backyard near the swimming pool. The observations were not prompted by alarm, shouting, or requests for help. Instead, they were triggered by unusual movement where none was expected. One neighbor recalled seeing a man standing over the pool, his posture rigid, his movements deliberate. From that vantage point, the figure appeared to be restraining someone in the water. The scene did not resemble casual swimming or play. The body language suggested force, not interaction. Another neighbor, viewing from a different angle, described a similar image, a man leaning over the pool, holding someone down. The person in the water was largely obscured, but the positioning was consistent with restraint. These observations were made independently, without coordination or shared discussion at the time. Importantly, the witnesses did not immediately interpret what they were seeing as a homicide in progress. There were no screams that carried through the neighborhood, no calls for help that prompted an emergency response. From a distance, and without context, the scene was ambiguous. This ambiguity explains why police were not contacted during the night. The witnesses did not dismiss what they saw, but neither did they recognize it as an immediate threat. In quiet suburban environments, unusual activity does not always translate to criminal activity. What mattered later was consistency. When investigators interviewed neighbors after Jarmila Falater's body was discovered, the accounts aligned on key points: the time frame, the location, the posture of the man by the pool, the presence of force. None of the witnesses claimed to hear an argument. None described multiple people. None reported seeing a stranger enter or leave the property. The observations focused on a single individual, acting alone. As detectives compared these statements, a pattern emerged. The witnesses were not describing separate incidents. They were describing different angles of the same event. This had immediate implications for the investigation. The neighbor accounts placed a man at the pool during the estimated time of death. They described sustained physical interaction, not a brief encounter. They suggested that the activity lasted long enough to be noticed, watched, and later recalled with clarity. Crucially, these observations contradicted the explanation that would later be offered by Scott Falater. Falater would claim that he had no memory of the events, that he had been asleep, that his actions, if they occurred at all, were the result of sleepwalking. According to his account, there was no conscious awareness, no deliberate restraint, no sequence of intentional acts. The neighbor testimony did not support that version. The man described by witnesses appeared focused. His movements were purposeful. He remained engaged in the activity for an extended period. There was no indication of confusion, wandering, or disorientation. Nothing in the description suggested a person acting unconsciously or erratically. Investigators paid close attention to these details. In cases where sleep disorders are later claimed, eyewitness observations can be decisive. Sleepwalking episodes, when they occur, are typically characterized by aimless movement, lack of coordination, and minimal sustained interaction with others. The scene described by neighbors did not fit that pattern. Additionally, the witnesses noted that after the activity at the pool ended, the area returned to stillness. There was no frantic movement, no sudden departure, no visible distress. The absence of chaos suggested that the event concluded with intention rather than interruption. When detectives revisited the timeline, the neighbor observations aligned with forensic findings. The estimated time of death corresponded with the period during which the witnesses saw activity. The position of the body in the pool was consistent with their accounts. These correlations strengthened the reliability of the testimony. The witnesses did not know one another well. They did not communicate about their observations before speaking with police. Their statements were recorded independently. This independence mattered. It reduced the likelihood of influence or suggestion. It allowed investigators to treat the accounts as separate confirmations of the same behavior. The defense would later argue that the witnesses misinterpreted what they saw. That distance, darkness, and lack of context could have distorted perception. These arguments were considered, but the consistency of the accounts made them difficult to dismiss. The observations also narrowed the scope of possible explanations. If a man was seen restraining a woman in the Falater pool during the night, then the idea of an accidental drowning became untenable. The act described required force. It required sustained pressure. It required awareness of another person's presence. For investigators, this shifted the case decisively. The question was no longer whether a crime had occurred. It was who had committed it, and under what circumstances. The neighbor testimony did not identify the man by name, but the context did that work. The activity took place in the Falater backyard. No evidence suggested an outsider had entered the property. The observations occurred during hours when household access would have been limited. This placed the focus squarely on the residents of the home. When Falater was later questioned about the night, he did not dispute that his wife was in the pool. He did not challenge the physical evidence. Instead, he challenged the interpretation of his own actions. The witness accounts made that challenge difficult to sustain. They described not a momentary lapse, but a sequence. Not confusion, but control. Not wandering, but restraint. As the investigation progressed, the neighbor testimony became one of the prosecution's strongest tools. It bridged the gap between physical evidence and intent. It provided an external perspective on events that occurred away from immediate documentation. The neighbors did not set out to witness a crime. They did not expect to become central figures in a homicide case. Their observations were incidental, made without anticipation of significance. That is what gave them weight. In the quiet of the Ahwatukee foothills, fragments of the night had been seen and remembered. Those fragments, when assembled, contradicted the story that would later be told. They did not explain motive. They did not define intent on their own, but they established behavior that was deliberate, sustained, and inconsistent with unconscious action. By the time investigators completed their interviews, the case had moved beyond uncertainty. The neighbor accounts had fixed a moment in time and placed an individual within it. The night was no longer unknowable. It had witnesses, and what they saw would become impossible to reconcile with the explanation that followed. When daylight returned to the Ahwatukee foothills neighborhood on the morning of January 17, 1997, nothing immediately signaled that a crime had taken place. The street was quiet. Houses appeared unchanged. The calm of the suburban setting remained intact. The first indication that something was wrong came when Jarmila Falater did not appear as expected. Her routine was interrupted. Attempts to locate her led to the backyard, where her body was found in the swimming pool. At first glance, the scene suggested the possibility of an accident. Swimming pools in residential areas are not uncommon sites for accidental drownings, particularly during nighttime hours. There was no visible damage to the property, no signs of forced entry, no immediate evidence of a struggle extending beyond the pool area. Emergency responders were called, and Jarmila Falater was pronounced dead at the scene. In the earliest moments, investigators approached the situation cautiously. Accidental drowning was considered a plausible explanation, at least temporarily. The body's position in the pool and the absence of obvious external disturbance supported that initial assumption. That explanation did not last long. As officers examined the scene more closely, they began to notice details that did not align with an accidental fall. Jarmila Falater had multiple stab wounds. These injuries were inconsistent with a simple slip or loss of balance. Blood was found in areas of the house, not just near the pool. The presence of these injuries immediately shifted the investigation. What had first appeared ambiguous now required reevaluation. The wounds themselves were significant. They were not superficial. They indicated an assault that had occurred prior to the drowning. Medical personnel would later confirm that the stab wounds alone were not the cause of death, but their existence ruled out accident as an explanation. Investigators expanded their examination of the property. Inside the house, they located blood traces that suggested the attack had begun indoors. These traces were not extensive, but they were clear enough to establish a sequence. Violence had occurred inside the home before Jarmila Falater was moved outside. The condition of the house was notable. There was no sign of disorder. Furniture was undisturbed. There were no overturned items, no broken objects, no evidence of a struggle spreading throughout the rooms. The environment appeared controlled. Equally important was what investigators did not find. There were no signs of forced entry. Doors and windows were intact. Locks were undamaged. The property perimeter showed no indication that an unknown person had entered or exited during the night. This absence of intrusion narrowed the scope of possible explanations. If the attack began inside the house and no forced entry occurred, then the person responsible had legitimate access. Attention turned to Scott Falater. Falater's behavior that morning became part of the investigative record. He did not display visible panic. He did not immediately report a violent crime. Instead, he appeared calm, even subdued. His account of the events was limited. He stated that he had no memory of anything unusual occurring during the night. Falater explained that he had gone to bed and slept through the night. He claimed that he did not know how his wife ended up in the pool. He did not offer an explanation for the injuries at that point. This lack of explanation was significant. In situations involving accidental deaths, individuals often attempt to reconstruct events, even imperfectly. Falater did not. He maintained that he had no recollection of the night's events. Investigators documented his statements carefully. At this stage, they did not challenge his account directly. The focus remained on gathering facts and confirming the sequence of events. As the medical examiner's findings became clearer, the gap between the initial accident theory and the physical evidence widened. The stab wounds confirmed that Jarmila Falater had been attacked before she drowned. This fact alone reclassified the death as a homicide. The pool was no longer the primary site of injury. It was the final location in a sequence that began elsewhere. The discovery of blood inside the house reinforced this conclusion. The attack had not been confined to the backyard. It had started indoors, in a controlled environment, away from public view. Investigators now faced a critical question. How could an accident theory account for a multi-stage sequence involving stabbing, relocation, and drowning? It could not. As detectives reviewed Falater's statements alongside the physical evidence, inconsistencies became apparent. His claim of sleeping through the night did not align with the complexity of the events that had occurred. The actions required to carry out the sequence demanded sustained physical effort and awareness. At this point, the investigation shifted decisively. The question was no longer whether Jarmila Falater's death was accidental. It was who had inflicted the injuries and why. The absence of forced entry continued to shape the inquiry. No evidence suggested an outsider had entered the home. No neighbors reported unfamiliar vehicles or individuals. The environment offered no support for an external attacker theory. Falater's calm demeanor, while not incriminating on its own, stood in contrast to the gravity of the situation. Investigators noted his composure, but did not interpret it as proof of guilt. Instead, it became part of a broader behavioral assessment. As the morning progressed, the scene was secured, documented, and processed. Photographs were taken, evidence was collected. Each element was recorded to support later reconstruction. By midday, the accident theory had been formally abandoned. The case was classified as a homicide. This reclassification marked a turning point. The events of the night were no longer ambiguous. They required explanation through intent, action, and sequence. The focus of the investigation narrowed. For the first time, the quiet routine that had defined the Falater household was replaced by scrutiny. The controlled environment that once suggested stability now raised questions about access and opportunity. The morning after did not bring chaos or public spectacle. It brought a slow, methodical realization that the death could not be explained by chance. The gap between what appeared to have happened and what Falater claimed to remember was widening. The physical evidence spoke clearly. The explanation did not. This divergence would shape the next phase of the investigation. What began as a possible accident had become a deliberate act. What remained unclear was how Falater would account for the evidence that contradicted his version of events. The calm of the neighborhood remained unchanged, but the assumptions that defined the case had shifted permanently. From this point forward, the investigation would focus not on what had been found, but on how it could have happened within a home that showed no sign of intrusion, and on the man who said he had slept through it all. When investigators confronted Scott Falater with the physical evidence from the scene, his explanation did not evolve gradually. It shifted abruptly. Falater stated that he had no memory of the events that occurred during the night. According to him, there was no argument, no confrontation, and no awareness of violence. He claimed that he had gone to bed and slept through the night. This assertion became the foundation of his defense. Falater told investigators that if he had harmed his wife, it must have occurred while he was sleepwalking. He described a complete absence of recollection. He did not claim partial awareness or confusion. His position was absolute. He had been unconscious during the events in question. From a procedural standpoint, this claim required careful handling. Sleepwalking, or somnambulism, is a recognized parasomnia. In rare cases, individuals have been known to perform complex actions while not fully conscious. As a result, the claim could not be dismissed outright without examination. Investigators documented Falater's statement and initiated the next step: verification. Medical experts were consulted to assess whether Falater had a documented history of sleep disorders. Records were reviewed. Family members and acquaintances were questioned about any previous episodes of sleepwalking or unusual nighttime behavior. The inquiry extended beyond Falater's own account, seeking corroboration from independent sources. No substantial evidence of chronic sleepwalking emerged. There were no medical diagnoses on record, no reports of past episodes involving complex or violent behavior. This absence did not automatically invalidate the claim, but it weakened its foundation. The defense later expanded on the argument during pretrial proceedings. Expert witnesses were prepared to explain how parasomnias can manifest without warning, and how individuals in such states may perform coordinated actions without conscious intent. The argument emphasized that lack of memory was consistent with sleepwalking. The prosecution examined this theory from a different angle. Rather than focusing solely on the possibility of unconscious movement, investigators and prosecutors evaluated the sequence of actions involved in the crime. They asked whether those actions were consistent with known patterns of parasomnias. The events of the night were not confined to a single brief act. They involved multiple stages: an attack inside the house, movement to the backyard, restraint in the pool, and post-event behavior including cleaning and concealment. Each stage required sustained physical engagement and interaction with the environment. Prosecutors argued that such a sequence was incompatible with sleepwalking. They pointed to the absence of confusion, wandering, or interruption. The actions appeared goal-directed and continuous. Medical experts called by the prosecution testified that while sleepwalkers can perform basic tasks, the complexity and duration of the actions in this case exceeded what would be expected in an unconscious state. The act of holding someone underwater, maintaining pressure, and then engaging in cleanup required awareness of resistance, timing, and consequence. The issue of post-event behavior became particularly significant. Evidence showed that the knife used in the attack had been cleaned, and that blood-stained clothing had been removed and concealed. These actions suggested an understanding of evidence and an effort to manage it. From an investigative standpoint, this behavior was inconsistent with a parasomniac episode. Sleepwalking episodes typically end with the individual returning to bed or becoming disoriented. They do not usually involve deliberate steps to eliminate traces of activity. Falater's lack of memory remained central to his account. He did not attempt to explain how the actions occurred, only that he was not conscious of them. This placed the burden of interpretation on the court. The prosecution framed the defense as a strategy rather than an explanation. They argued that the claim of sleepwalking emerged only after the physical evidence eliminated accident as a possibility. It was presented as an alternative that avoided intent without addressing the sequence of actions. Jurors were instructed to consider the totality of evidence. The question was not whether sleepwalking exists, but whether it plausibly explained the specific events of that night. Witness testimony played a critical role in this evaluation. Neighbors described Falater's behavior at the pool as controlled and sustained. They did not observe confusion or erratic movement. The consistency of these accounts undermined the idea of unconscious action. Investigators also noted that Falater's behavior after the incident did not reflect confusion upon waking. He did not appear disoriented. He did not express shock at discovering evidence of activity he could not remember. His responses were measured. The defense emphasized the absence of motive and the lack of prior violence. They argued that without a clear reason, unconscious action remained a viable explanation. The prosecution countered that motive was not required to establish consciousness, particularly when behavior itself demonstrated awareness. Throughout the proceedings, the sleepwalking defense remained the central point of contention. It was not dismissed as impossible, it was evaluated against evidence. In the end, the theory failed not because it was unfamiliar, but because it did not align with the documented sequence of events. The actions were too structured, too prolonged, and too responsive to be attributed to a state of unconsciousness. The defense had provided an explanation that removed intent, but it could not account for control. This distinction would prove decisive. When the case against Scott Falater reached trial, the courtroom proceedings reflected the same tone that had defined the investigation: methodical, evidence-driven, and focused on reconstruction rather than speculation. The central issue was not whether Jarmila Falater had been killed. That fact was uncontested. But whether the actions that led to her death were carried out with conscious awareness. From the outset, the prosecution avoided emotionally charged language. Instead, it presented a chronological reconstruction of the night, supported by witness testimony and forensic findings. Jurors were guided through the sequence of events step by step, beginning with the attack inside the house and ending with the discovery of the body in the pool. Eyewitness testimony formed a critical pillar of the prosecution's case. Neighbors took the stand and described what they had observed during the late hours of January 16, 1997. Their accounts were presented individually, emphasizing that they had not coordinated their observations or discussed them prior to speaking with police. Each witness described seeing a man at the pool, restraining a woman in the water for an extended period. The descriptions aligned in time, location, and behavior. The prosecution highlighted that these observations depicted sustained physical control rather than erratic or aimless movement. Jurors were asked to consider whether such behavior was consistent with unconscious activity. The witnesses did not describe confusion, hesitation, or disorientation. They described restraint. Forensic experts then addressed the physical evidence. Medical testimony confirmed that Jarmila Falater had suffered multiple stab wounds before drowning. These wounds were located in areas consistent with an assault inside the home. Blood evidence corroborated that sequence, establishing that the attack began indoors and continued outside. Crime scene analysts testified about the condition of the house and yard. There were no signs of forced entry. Doors and windows were intact. The house showed no widespread disorder. These findings supported the conclusion that the perpetrator had free access to the property and familiarity with its layout. Attention then turned to actions taken after the fatal events. Investigators described how the knife used in the attack had been cleaned and how blood-stained clothing had been removed and concealed. These steps were presented as deliberate acts that required awareness of evidence and consequence. The prosecution argued that such behavior could not be explained by unconsciousness. The defense, in contrast, centered its case entirely on the claim of sleepwalking. Expert witnesses explained parasomnias and cited instances in which individuals performed complex actions while not fully conscious. The defense emphasized Falater's lack of memory and the absence of a documented history of violence. Jurors were instructed that the existence of sleepwalking as a medical phenomenon was not in dispute. What they were asked to determine was whether that phenomenon plausibly explained the specific actions documented in this case. Under cross-examination, prosecution experts addressed the limits of parasomniac behavior. They testified that while sleepwalking can involve movement and simple tasks, it rarely includes prolonged, goal-directed violence followed by cleanup. The sequence of events, stabbing, relocation, drowning, and evidence management, was presented as exceeding those limits. Falater did not deny that the events occurred. His defense rested solely on the assertion that he was not conscious when they did. The prosecution countered that consciousness could be inferred from behavior, not memory. They argued that awareness is demonstrated by action, not recollection. In closing arguments, the prosecution returned to continuity. They emphasized that the events of the night unfolded without interruption. There was no break in behavior, no indication of confusion, and no external interference. Each step followed logically from the previous one. The jury deliberated with these considerations in mind. Their task was not to speculate about motive or emotion, but to assess whether the evidence supported the claim of unconscious action. After reviewing the testimony and exhibits, they reached a unanimous conclusion. Scott Falater was found guilty of murder. At sentencing, the court reviewed the nature of the offense and the jury's findings. The absence of mitigating factors related to mental incapacity weighed heavily. The sentence imposed was life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, reflecting the determination that the crime was deliberate and conscious. The legal outcome closed the criminal proceedings, but the case continued to resonate beyond the courtroom. It became a reference point in discussions of criminal responsibility, particularly in cases involving claims of unconscious behavior. Courts and legal scholars would later cite the Falater case when examining the boundaries of sleep-related defenses. For investigators, the case underscored the importance of reconstruction over assumption. For the jury, it demonstrated how intent can be inferred from sustained action rather than verbal explanation. For the legal system, it reinforced that extraordinary defenses require extraordinary support. The consequences extended beyond sentencing. 2 children were left without parents. A suburban neighborhood was permanently altered by an act that had occurred without warning. A controlled, routine life collapsed under scrutiny that revealed actions incompatible with its outward stability. The trial did not resolve every question about why the crime occurred. It resolved how it occurred and who was responsible. That distinction shaped the verdict. The record of the case remains defined by evidence. What was seen, what was measured, and what could not be reconciled with the explanation offered. The judgment did not rely on narrative. It relied on documented behavior. That framework, evidence over assertion, ultimately determined the outcome.